the sound of children laughing still hung in the air when the backyard fell into a sudden, icy silence. Balloons tapped against one another in the breeze, and I remember the sunlight hitting the metal of the handcuffs just as the officers stepped forward. My heart didn't race. It dropped, heavy and certain, like it had been waiting for this moment all along. If you've ever watched the truth explode in front of you when you least expected it, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. You're not as alone as you think. For a split second, I stood there surrounded by cake crumbs, birthday ribbons, and the wreckage of a life I'd tried so hard to rebuild. I didn't realize it yet, but that was the moment everything began to unravel. Let me show you how it all started. I never imagined I would watch my ex-husband get taken away in handcuffs in the middle of my granddaughter's birthday party. Yet that was exactly what happened. One moment, the backyard was full of laughter and the smell of barbecue. And the next, it felt like the air snapped. Real detectives stepped forward, their voices low but firm, and I stood there frozen, trying to make sense of the chaos unfolding a few feet away. I could feel every pair of eyes flicking between him and me, as if the whole family suddenly realized there were pieces of my life they had never bothered to ask about. I'm 51, a digital consultant in Madison, Wisconsin. My business is small, steady, nothing flashy. I've always lived quietly, never drawing attention to myself. But over these past months, my life has been anything but quiet. What happened at that party wasn't some sudden shock. It was the breaking point in a long, exhausting chain of manipulation, accusations, and fear that had been tightening around me for years. Standing there, I felt a mix of disbelief and a strange, painful relief. Part of me grieved the man I once trusted. Another part of me finally exhaled. And to understand how everything spiraled into that moment, I need to take you back to where it all began. After the divorce, my life shrank down to a small rental on the east side of Madison, a quiet place with creaky floors and sunlight that spilled across the living room every morning. It wasn't much, but it felt like a space where I could breathe again. For a long time, I didn't realize how much of myself I had lost during those years with Greg Sanders. I had gotten used to questioning every instinct, second-guessing every decision, and shrinking whenever he dismissed my ideas as unrealistic or foolish. When I finally stepped away, it felt like learning how to walk again. My digital consulting work started slowly, almost timidly. A few local clients, then a couple of referrals. Nothing big. Just enough to keep my bills paid and give me a sense of purpose. I wasn't chasing some grand future. I just wanted stability and a life where I could hear my own thoughts without someone twisting them. My relationship with my daughter, Allison, was tender but complicated. She loved me. I know that. But years of watching me bend myself around her father had shaped her in ways she didn't fully understand. Sometimes I could feel her wrestling with her loyalty to him and her worry for me, and I never blamed her for that tension. Still, even in the calm of my new routine, there were moments when something inside me tightened, a feeling I couldn't name, as if parts of my past hadn't finished with me yet. I didn't know it then, but that quiet, fragile stability was about to crack the morning I heard an unexpected knock at my front door. It was one of those quiet mornings when everything felt steady. I had brewed my coffee, opened my laptop, and settled into the slow rhythm of answering emails. The house was calm, the kind of calm I had spent years trying to rebuild. For a moment, I let myself feel proud of that. Then, around 8:30, a sharp knock cut through the stillness, It wasn't the casual tap of a delivery driver. It sounded purposeful, almost rehearsed. When I opened the door, two men stood on the porch. They carried themselves like investigators, but something in their posture felt off. Too stiff, too eager. They introduced themselves, but their names slipped past me because my instincts were already tightening. They said they needed to review my business records, their explanation vague and oddly scripted. I remember feeling a wave of confusion, followed immediately by a steadier kind of caution. I kept my voice calm, even though my mind was racing. I told them I couldn't hand over anything without proper documentation. I could see the flicker in their expressions. Surprise, maybe irritation, that I didn't simply fold. They pressed in subtle ways, asking more questions that didn't quite align. Their confidence seemed to shrink the longer I held my ground. When they finally left, the silence in the house felt heavier than before. I stood near the window and watched them walk to their car, whispering to each other with a nervous edge. That's when something cold settled in my chest. Their visit wasn't random. It didn't feel official. It felt personal. And in that uneasy stillness, one name rose in my mind. A name tied to years of quiet undermining Greg. I didn't have proof yet, but I could feel the first tug of a much deeper pull heading straight toward my family. For the rest of that morning, the visit from those investigators clung to me like a cold shadow. I kept replaying their questions, their strange hesitations, the way they seemed almost disappointed when I didn't hand them anything. Even after they drove off, the air in my house felt unsettled, as if they had carried something in with them and left it behind. Later that afternoon, I called Allison, partly to hear her voice and partly because I needed to feel grounded again. But the moment I brought up what happened, I felt that old, familiar sting. She didn't accuse me of anything, not directly, but her tone carried traces of Greg's old doubt, the same doubt he used to drip into every conversation when we were still together. She asked if I was sure I hadn't misunderstood, if maybe I was overreacting, if things were really as strange as I made them sound. Hearing her echo the very patterns that once kept me small tightened something in my chest. It pulled up memories I usually keep buried, years of being talked over, dismissed, told I was imagining problems that were right in front of me. I used to fold under that pressure without even realizing it. But this time, I felt something different. A quiet firmness, a steadier center. I could recognize the manipulation, even secondhand, and I knew exactly where it came from. As I sat there with the phone still warm in my hand, a heavy understanding settled over me. Greg was stirring something up behind the scenes. Those men hadn't shown up by accident, and if he was already influencing Allison without her knowing, then whatever he was planning wasn't small. That evening, I gathered my business files, organized everything neatly, and told myself I would be ready for whatever came next. I didn't know the full shape of the storm yet, but I could feel it gathering, waiting for the moment it would break. And it broke sooner than I expected, at my granddaughter's birthday party. When I pulled up to Allison's house for the birthday party, I felt a strange tightness in my chest. The front yard was decorated with pastel balloons, and children were running across the lawn. But something in the air felt off. It took me a moment to notice the unfamiliar cars lining the street. Not neighbors, not family. Too clean, too coordinated. My instincts sharpened the second I stepped out of my car. In the backyard, people I didn't recognize lingered near the edges of the crowd. They tried to blend in, but their eyes kept drifting toward me. Their posture was the same kind of stiff I'd seen on my porch. The realization settled in quickly and painfully. Greg had set something up. I could almost feel his presence in the way the air tightened around those strangers. Allison kept looking at me with a mix of worry and confusion. I could tell she was trying to convince herself that everything was fine. But her glances toward those men told a different story. I hated that she'd been pulled into this without understanding what was happening. Before long, two of the men stepped closer, carrying the same air of authority the earlier investigators had tried to imitate. They started circling around the conversation, clearly waiting for the right moment to corner me. I felt my pulse rise, but I also felt the quiet steadiness I'd been building these past months. I reached into my bag and calmly pulled out the neatly organized business records I'd prepared. When I held them out, I watched something shift in their expressions, an uneasy flicker, as if they hadn't expected me to be ready. The tension around us thickened. Their questions grew sharper, but less confident. Their act was cracking, and they could sense it. Then, just as one of them tried to regain control, a pair of real law enforcement vehicles rolled up to the house. The energy snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Officers stepped out with a very different kind of authority, one that made those fake investigators freeze. And in that instant, I knew everything was about to unravel. When the real detectives stepped into the backyard, everything around us shifted. The chatter of the party faded into a strange silence, the kind that wraps itself around a moment you know you'll never forget. They moved with a calm, practiced authority, and the men who had been pretending to investigate me stiffened instantly. I watched their confidence drain from their faces as the detectives asked who they were and why they were there. It didn't take long for everyone to realize these men had no credentials, no authority, and no legitimate purpose. Then Greg appeared from the back patio, trying to act surprised, trying to position himself as someone who had simply been concerned. But even from a distance, I could see the panic rising in him. It was in the way he kept glancing at the impostors, hoping they would say something that would keep his story intact. Instead, they were crumbling in front of him. The detectives pulled the men aside, and within minutes, the truth started spilling out. Unlicensed work, impersonation, connections to a fraudulent network. And then one of the detectives turned toward Greg, asking him to step forward. I remember feeling the world slow down in that moment. Years of doubt, years of being told I was imagining things, years of carrying the weight of his manipulation. All of it felt as if it were being lifted piece by piece. Greg tried to explain himself, but the words fell apart as soon as they left his mouth. His voice shook. His excuses contradicted each other. And when they placed him in cuffs, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. A long, quiet release I had been waiting for without even realizing it. For the first time in years, I could breathe without questioning myself. As they led Greg away, one of the detectives approached me, asking gently if we could talk further. And just like that, the chaos of the party shifted into something bigger, an investigation that was only beginning. When the backyard finally emptied out, the quiet felt almost unreal. A few crumpled plates sat on the tables, balloons dragged in the grass, and children whispered to each other as if the air itself might break if they spoke too loudly. Relatives lingered near the gate, glancing at me with a mixture of sympathy and uncertainty, unsure whether to approach or pretend nothing had happened. I stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle over me, trying to steady my breath after everything that had just unfolded. One of the detectives approached gently and asked if we could talk somewhere private. Allison's eyes followed me as I walked inside with them, confusion and worry mixing on her face. I wanted to reassure her, but I didn't have the right words yet. Inside the house, away from the scattered birthday decorations, the reality of the situation deepened. The detectives laid out the basics of what they could share. What I thought had been isolated harassment, those strange visits, the intimidation, the pressure, was part of a broader pattern they'd been tracking for months. There were other victims, other impersonations, other schemes that looked different on the surface but carried the same fingerprints underneath. Hearing that made my stomach drop. It meant Greg hadn't just slipped into old habits. He'd been tangled in something far darker and far larger than I ever imagined. As they talked, pieces of my past snapped together in ways that were both painful and clarifying. Little inconsistencies I had ignored. Sudden financial decisions he made without explanation. The way he always seemed to know things before he should have. Moments I once brushed off as paranoia suddenly made perfect sense. I felt a slow wave of grief for the years I spent doubting my instincts, believing every dismissal he fed me. The detectives told me they needed my perspective, not just as someone affected recently, but as someone who had lived close enough to Greg to recognize patterns they might miss. Hearing that shifted something inside me. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting to what he had done. I was becoming part of uncovering the truth. By the time our conversation ended, the weight of the situation had doubled, but so had my clarity. This wasn't just about me anymore. The investigation was widening, pulling in threads that stretched back years, maybe longer. And as overwhelming as it felt, it also marked the beginning of something I hadn't experienced in a long time, the chance to step into the light instead of the shadows he left me in. When the investigation finally reached its full shape, I felt something inside me settle in a way I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't relief exactly, at least not at first. It was more like standing in the sunlight after spending too long in a dim room. Your eyes sting, your body hesitates, and then slowly, you realize you're safe to breathe. For so long, I had carried pieces of fear and doubt without knowing where they belonged. Now I could finally see the whole picture, and the truth gave me room to reclaim parts of myself I thought I had lost forever. The detectives kept me updated as they unraveled more threads, and each update helped me understand just how deep Greg's deception went. It was painful to accept that the person I once built a life with had woven himself into something so harmful, but acknowledging it also gave me back my voice. I stopped blaming myself for the blind spots. I stopped telling myself I should have known better. I realized I did the best I could with the information I had, and that was enough. My relationship with Allison softened in unexpected ways. After the shock of the party wore off, she came to me with a heaviness I recognized, the weight of seeing someone you trusted shatter their own image. She told me she finally understood how deeply Greg's influence had shaped her thinking. I didn't need apologies. I just needed honesty, and she gave me that. Slowly, we started rebuilding our connection, this time on steadier ground. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that mattered more than anything. As for my life in Madison, I found myself moving differently through my days. I still lived in my modest rental, still tended to my consulting work, still kept my routine simple. But there was a quiet confidence beneath everything now. I trusted my instincts more. I wasn't afraid to take up space in my own life. I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't shaped by someone else's shadows. What surprised me most was how healing didn't come from dramatic moments. It came from small ones. Mornings when my coffee tasted a little richer. Afternoons when I caught myself humming. Evenings when I realized I hadn't thought about Greg at all. Those were the moments that stitched me back together. If there's anything this entire experience taught me, it's that your intuition is worth listening to, even when it scares you, especially when it scares you, and that you're allowed to walk away from people who make you doubt your own truth. Thank you for walking through this with me. If any part of my story reminds you of something in your own life, I hope you'll share it. I read every comment, and you never know who might need to hear what you've learned. Thank you for staying with me through this entire journey. Sharing it wasn't easy, but speaking it out loud helped me see how far I've come. If there's anything I hope you take from my story, it's that your instincts matter. Even when the world tries to convince you otherwise, your voice deserves space, and your truth deserves respect. Healing isn't sudden. It's a series of small moments where you choose yourself again and again. If any part of my experience touches something in your own life, I hope you'll share it below. I read every comment, and your words may help someone else feel less alone. And if this story resonated with you, I'd be grateful if you liked the video and subscribed for more. Thank you for being here. It truly means more than you know today here.